Joanna.
Okay, good evening, everybody. We'll start with our list of association reps. Diane Vandenbosch. And please remember to go off mute. I see Diane's present. Allison Brindle.
Present.
Judy Shields. James Baldwin.
Present.
Diane Miller. I don't think she's present. Hetal Shaw. No. Lisa Cameron. Melissa Dockery.
Present.
So we have regrets from Sophia and from Mike Brown. Lucille Morris is present. And we've got the trustees, Margot Shuttleworth.
Good evening, everyone.
Tracy L. Harrison.
Hello, everyone. Present.
Heather Garretts.
Hi, everybody.
Okay, and with us, we also have our staff, Superintendent of Education, Mark Zonneveld, Principal of Student Services, Sean Marks, and our Administrative Assistant and CX Secretary, Lorna Goodrow. In addition, we have two guests, and that's Director of Education, Stuart Miller, and Superintendent of Business Services, Roxana Nagoy. So welcome, everybody. And over to you, Lou.
We will begin by honoring the land, and I'd like to ask Margot to do the presentation.
All right, thank you, Lou. Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather here today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, water, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations for sharing their traditional territory with us.
Thank you. We need to approve the agenda for tonight's meeting.
If you could introduce our guest.
I'd like to introduce our guest, Sean Miller. Sean?
Thanks, Lucille. It's Stuart Miller, but that's okay.
Oh, Stuart, sorry.
An Irish versus a Straught, that's easy. So I want to welcome everybody tonight and thank you all for coming. And, you know, as director, I go to a couple of SEAC meetings a year, and I was unable to get to one, and I was planning on coming to a few in the spring. So I was at the last one and I'm at this one, but it's unfortunate that the ones I've come to are these. But I do applaud your perseverance on working through the electronics and the virtual meetings. I know many of you are probably having all sorts of virtual meetings and phones, and these can get to you. The body language, the nuances, they're pretty difficult to read a lot of the time. So I applaud you for working through that. But more importantly, I applaud you for continuing to keep our feet to the fire around those issues which impact our students with the greatest needs, students with special needs. I'm proud of what our staff has done. We've worked really hard and completely transformed education in a very short period of time to deliver it through distance learning. But we know that there's still much to be done. We know that in particular, there are some kids, most likely students with special needs, who are not having the same experience and who need to be in school, and various other challenges that they are facing that other students may not. So we're continuing to work on that through the leadership of Sean and Marks and of course Mark. Their staff has been working hard to try to make this happen, as has most of our, not most, all of our other staff in contacting kids, getting a hold of them. I would ask that, we know that it's not going perfect. We know that there's issues still out there, and we're trying to work through them best we can. But even working through them is difficult virtually. By the time you get a hold of people and deal with that and do this, it makes everything take much, much longer. So I ask for your patience and thank you for your patience. I know for those students, they're probably impatient, rightfully so, and we will try our best to work with them and make sure that they are getting their needs met and being supported in a way that advances both their education and their social engagement, because we know that many students are having challenges with being socially engaged at this time because everybody's sitting in their houses. So I want to thank SEAC and all the members of SEAC for the work you're doing, and thank you for the support you're providing our Student Services Department and Mark in particular. And I don't have anything to add to anything more than that, Lucille, but I could take a couple questions before turning it back to you if you want. It's up to you.
If anybody has a question for Director Miller, please indicate so in the chat box by hand up, stating hand. Please.
Appears not, Joanna. So I'll stay
Okay.
on for Roxana's presentation and see the types of questions that might be asked there, because that'll inform us in getting work to the Board of Trustees through the consultations with SEAC. Okay. Thank you, Lucille. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, everybody in SEAC.
Thank you, Stuart. Over to you, Lucille.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We now need to approve the agenda for tonight's meeting.
Deidre, would you like to move a motion to approve the agenda for tonight? I see that as a yes. And Allison, would you like to second that motion?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Lou.
Okay. Next up is the approval of our April 7th meeting minutes. Are there any errors or omissions? If you wish to speak, please indicate so in the chat box by typing in hand.
Okay, I don't see any speakers on the list. So James, would you like to move a motion to approve the minutes of last month's meeting?
Okay, I'd like to make a motion to move the minutes from last month meeting.
Thank you. And Diane, would you like to second this motion? I take that as a yes, but you need to go off mute. Okay, we can't hear you. Diane, you need to press on the bottom of your screen. You'll see an icon that says that has the mic. There we go.
My mic's on now.
Yeah.
It wasn't coming up before, but it did then.
Okay, so would you like to second this motion?
Yes, please. I will second the motion.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Lou.
Thank you. We are now on to the action items. The first up is the presentation of the Superintendent of Business Services, Roxana.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me this evening. I'm going to be presenting my screen, the presentation that I will be going through this evening. If you have any trouble seeing the presentation, please let me know. So for this evening, I wanted to walk you through The school board financial reporting cycle give you a bit of an update on the budget development process. We will go through the grants for student needs and the various allocations and how we get funded, the key budget components for next year. Also, we would like to review the current year special education grant and revenue streams, as well as the expenses. And finally, we'll end the presentation with some consideration for the next year's budget, in particular, how they pertain to special education. I know the presentation is quite lengthy. I'm not going to go through all the slides, but they are for the benefit of the committee and our public. I wanted to provide them so that you can take them away. If there's any questions on some of the slides that maybe I am not going to be speaking to, please let me know. I'd be happy to answer them. So with regards to the school board financial reporting cycles, there are three main cycles. The budget estimate is the current process. It is developed before the end of June, which is 3 months before the beginning of our fiscal year. Our fiscal year runs from September 1st to August 31st. And the main basis for our funding is enrollment, which is taken at two count dates, October 31st and March 31st. For the budget process, both of these enrollment count dates are projected. We are projecting where we think the enrollment will be next year. The revised budget estimates is developed 3 months into the fiscal year. So we have an actual enrollment date of October 31st. It gives us a better projection as to where we expect to end the year. And the numbers that are in the presentation later on are from the revised budget estimates for the current year, 2019-2020. This revised budget is presented to the Board of Trustees and submitted to the Ministry of Education by mid-December. And finally, at the end of the fiscal year, we have the consolidated audited financial statements, which are based on actual enrollment for both of those count dates and actual expenditures for the year. And they are approved by the Board of Trustees and submitted to the Ministry by mid-November of every year. So the budget development process starts early on, usually in December or January, with an invitation from the Ministry of Education to provide input into the education funding consultation. For the 2020-2021 year, the consultation was released on January 13th. Both the senior staff as well as the Board of Trustees have submitted detailed responses as a result of the consultation. The input that was solicited was with regards to improving or continuing to refine the education formula and looking for efficiencies and reducing administrative burden. So there was some initial indication that there were going to be some additional tweaks to the education funding formula. And if we remember the previous year, funding reform resulted in significant reductions especially for a growth board such as ours. The enrollment projections that are sent to the ministry in November that project the enrollment for next year will form the basis for the grants for student needs, which are expected to be released by the Ministry of Education, hopefully this week. Typically, the grants for student needs are released at the end of March, which allows for more time for planning for the budget process. However, given the current year, we are going to be expecting it this week, and we have just a few short weeks to turn around a draft budget by the end of the month. The budget development process aligns the financial resources to our goals and strategic priorities, looking at our multi-year plan, operating plans, the special education plan, as well as the feedback that we receive from various stakeholders, both through a budget survey, the committee such as this, as well as the Board of Trustees. And finally, the budget has to be aligned with all of the compliance and ministry reporting requirements. This is slide 7 provides a timeline for the budget process. And as you can see, we are currently in the April-May, where we have finished the presentation to the Committee of the Whole for the April 22nd. All of our board reports and presentations are available on the website for the public. And the one piece there that we are still pending is the release of the GSN, or the Grants for Student Needs, which we're very eagerly expecting this week. In terms of other key dates, on May 27th, at the Committee of the Whole, we hope to have a draft budget presentation for the Board of Trustees and a final budget report for the June 17th meeting for the board's approval. And moving on to slide 9. So we're looking at the Grants for Student Needs are our provincial allocation or funding, which is the main source of funding for school boards. And the Grants for Student Needs are made up of a number of allocations. Some of them are in particular for special education, and some have funding that are meant to support or complement the special education funding. The Pupil Foundation grant is the grant that provides funding for the classroom teachers and other school support staff for the students. In particular, as it pertains to special education, it funds professional and paraprofessional supports, which include, for example, resources such as child and youth counselors, social workers, speech language pathologists, etc. The School Foundation grant is the grant that assists with the administration of the school, providing funding for the principal, school office staff, and school supplies. And then there are a number of allocations that are called special purpose grants, one of which being the special education grant. And there's a number of other grants that also provide or complement the special education grant, which includes, for example, the cost adjustment and teacher qualification and experience grant that provides additional funding to complement the compensation benchmarks for teaching staff, including special education resource teachers. The Student Transportation Grant, although there's no special funding for special education in particular that is earmarked, it does fund the transportation to special education programs and to provincial schools. The key budget components, enrollment is the main driver of our revenues. And also we wanted to give you a quick breakdown of the revenues and expenses as they pertain to the current year. So in terms of enrollment, I've mentioned before that being the main driver of our funding, we are using 2 count dates to get an average daily enrollment, so October 31st and March 31st. And enrollment projections are based on a variety of demographic data, birth rates, new housing, for example, catchment areas, as well as retention rates and program offerings in terms of attracting students to our schools. So if we look at enrollment as it is compared to the current year, so the projection for 2020-2021 is an increase over the current year revised estimates of over 1,000 students. We expect 339 more students in the elementary panel and 704 more students at the secondary panel. If we look at how that compares to the original budget, which was back in June, we are estimating over 1,274 more students. So we are certainly a growth board at both panels, but in particular, the secondary panel is where we expect to see the growth next year. If we look at slide 17, it outlines the distribution of revenues. The provincial grants or the grants for student needs represent 90.6% of our total revenue. So most of our revenues come from the province. We have additional sources of funding, including school-generated funds. So those are generated and fundraised at the school level. That's 2.5%. as well as the other fees and revenues. So that includes international student or visa students, as well as rental revenue. So that is 2.9%, and amortization of deferred capital contributions, which is a revenue source that offsets our non-cash expense for amortizing our buildings. On slide 19, it outlines the breakdown of expenses. We spend most of our money on instruction, so 78.6%, and an additional 14% on pupil accommodation, which refers to the operation expenses and maintenance of our schools, outdoor playgrounds, for example, and portables and temporary accommodations. We spend 2.4% on student transportation, and 2.7% other relates mostly to school-generated funds expenses. And on administration, it's 2.3% of the overall budget. That is corporate services and central staff. The next few slides just give you a bit more details about every category. And on slide 22, it gives you a breakdown between salary and non-salary expenses. We, as a service organization, spend 80% on salary and benefits. And the following two slides outline, as a percentage of salary or non-salary expenses, what are some of the categories on which we spend our budget. So I will leave those with you to review and go to slide 29, which outlines a little bit more what the special education grant components are. So there are 6 components that make up this allocation, and the special education grant overall is enveloped, which means it can only be used for special education expenditures, and any unused amount is deferred into the following year to be used in the future. So the next few slides outline every one of those 6 allocations. The special education per pupil amount is the amount that recognizes that there's additional assistance required for students with special needs, including mental health. This allocation is based on the overall enrollment of the school board and not in particular to identified students with special needs. The second allocation is a differentiated special education needs amount, which is mostly based on a statistical model that takes into account the various demographic factors that make up our region. This particular allocation, if we go to the next slide, also includes the multidisciplinary support amount, which is a new component since the prior year, and it helps to fund additional expertise, including psychologists, behavior specialists, and speech language pathologists. It is expected to continue for next year as well. The next portion of the grant is a special equipment amount, which is an enveloped amount that can be only spent on equipment that assists students with special needs. It includes a per pupil amount as well as the claim-based amount. On slide 33, we have the care, treatment, custody, and correctional amount, which support programs for school-age children and youth in various treatment facilities, including hospitals, psychiatric institutions, detention facilities, for example. And it's based on an approval process, and essentially we get funded for the expenses that we incur. Next, on slide 34, we have the special incidents portion. This in particular recognizes that there are students with extraordinarily high needs. Sometimes they need more than 2 full-time staff as a result of their disabilities and exceptionalities, and therefore there's some additional support that is provided. And finally, we have the behavior expertise amount and applied behavior analysis training. This particular allocation was doubled in the current year, and we're expecting it to continue at the same level next year, and provides additional support for professionals for applied behavior analysis and multidisciplinary teams. There are other areas, as I mentioned before, within the grants for student needs that are meant to complement special education. So Pupil Foundation provides support for professionals and paraprofessionals. The Cost Adjustment and Qualification and Experience Grant provides salary adjustments for special education resource teachers. The Transportation Allocation supports the transportation to various special education programs across our region. And the Board Administration and Governance Grant provides support for the Office of the Superintendent of Special Education or Student Services. So the next couple of slides break down our grant. It is for this year. And so we expect next year that growth will be built into this grant. And we also expect it to be more status quo. So we don't expect any changes in how special education is funded. So we'll expect to see an increase based on growth. So if we look through the next few slides, the total revenue for all of the amounts and all the allocations that I've mentioned amounts to $99.7 million. On slide 40, we're going through a breakdown of expenses, and I'm not going to go through them in detail. They're here for you. They're broken down by the employee group and various supplies and equipment that is being purchased. And if we go to page 4 or slide 41, the grand total of expenses for the current year is $119.4 million. In addition to these costs on slide 42, there's additional costs that are not captured within that amount, and that is the transportation for special education programs of $6.9 million, and the Board Administration and Governance grant covering for the mental health lead, the superintendent, executive assistant, and any operating costs for the office that are being covered from this particular grant. So that's a total of almost $7.4 million that are also related to special education, in addition to the ones on the previous slides. So if we're looking at the revenue versus expenses, expenses exceed the revenue in the current year in comparison to the prior year, the 18-19, which was $15.7 million. We are missing one component in terms of funding, and that is the local priority funding, which in the prior year was almost $3 million, but the current year was not provided. That was part of the labor negotiations. We are very fortunate and happy to report that of the groups that have ratified agreements, this amount seems to be coming back at about the same levels as the prior years. So next year, we expect to see a similar amount to be dedicated towards special education resources that we can add, and therefore reduce the overall deficit in special education. And I will also just remind you that there's other allocations within the grants that are meant to complement this and further reduce the deficit. Slide 44 outlines the full-time equivalent staffing by employee group, and it compares it to the prior year. You'll notice that it is about the same with the prior year, even though we had an increase of about 1,000 students over 18-19 as well. And if you were following along the budget process for the prior year, you'll remember that we had to make significant reductions. We've reduced 189 positions across all employee groups. Fortunately for special education, We have reduced some of the teachers where you see in the elementary and secondary teachers, but increased educational assistants, for example. And the teacher reductions are more related to changes in class sizes that were dictated in the grant for the current year. So budget considerations for next year. In terms of the provincial picture, there was an economic outlook that was presented on March 25th. Usually it would have been a provincial budget, which would have given us more details in what to expect when it comes to the education sector, but an outlook was presented in light of the COVID situation. What we saw from that is that there will be an expectation to increase the education sector revenue by about 500 million in next year, and that increase is meant to cover enrollment growth across the province and the compensation framework increase that was agreed upon at the central negotiation table. As well as cover for the support for student funding, which was negotiated part of the agreements that replaces local priority funding. Secondary class size has been expected to be a 23:1 and no change to the elementary class size. We also see that there's a decrease in the capital funding for the education sector expected for 400 million, which we would expect to see a reduction in the school renewal or school condition improvement funding, which is a capital funding source for maintaining our schools. All of the unions as of right now have ratified or tentative agreements, which is great news. And we're looking forward to getting the details of the last couple of agreements that are being currently ratified and seeing those changes reflected in the grants for student needs when it is released later this week. So from a board perspective, we are a growth board, and as a result, we're expected to be in a hiring position across multiple employee groups. As I mentioned before, the elementary class size remains at the current levels, and for our board, the class size of 23:1 means a decrease in class size and therefore a reduction in the number of sections and not a reduction, an increase in the number of sections and an increase in secondary teachers, because we are going to be dropping from 24.85:1 to 23:1 for the class size. I mentioned already that there is the restoration of the support for student funds, and as it resembles closely the prior local priority funding level, for our board, that amounted to 6.7 million in total per year. So that is a very much welcome infusion of funding into the sector. Given the current environment, we do have some challenges due to the travel restrictions. We're not sure whether international students will be able to travel and enter Canada in September. So we are therefore expecting that potentially to have fewer international students and a decrease in that revenue source. And interest rates have decreased significantly, which will also negatively impact our interest revenue. The school renewal and construction have been delayed. We do have some good news where we can start some of these projects now. However, it has put a strain on the supply chain, and we have to see what the impact will be on the availability of materials and pricing. So growth for us, those additional 1,000 students plus will mean that we will be increasing staffing levels across elementary teachers and secondary teachers. There's additional need for English as a second language and English language development teachers. There's an increase in school administration and school support staff as we're opening a new school, as well as increasing custodial staff. There's also areas of budget that are increasing due to various pressures. We have a new student information system being implemented that has higher software fees. There's increases in operating costs for schools and maintenance of schools and outdoor spaces, an increase in benefit costs and workplace safety and insurance board related claims, and certainly increasing the contingency to account for all the market uncertainty. We are continuing to focus on building new schools in North Oakville and South Milton in order to meet the demand of additional growth in students. So that is something that we're working on and looking forward to opening the new Northeast Oakville school in September. With regards to proposed investments, and these are listed in no particular order, priority order, they are focused on the special education resources that we are considering to add in the next year, if there's funding available. So not necessarily everything that has been listed will be able to be incorporated into the budget, but hopefully you will see these elements captured in next year's budget. There have been identified a need for additional self-contained classes, communication classes, a need for additional itinerant learning, disability, reading support teachers, special education resource teachers to address growth, specialized behavior support workers and applied behavior analysis facilitators, additional support for mental health strategy, and additional educational assistance. And lastly, we are looking at, as I mentioned, the release of the grants for student needs this week. Then we're marching ahead to have a draft budget for the presentation on May 27th. Depending on when the ministry forms are released, which typically follow 2 weeks after the release of the GSN, we may need to reschedule the committee of the whole meeting for a date in June. And if that's the case, we will let everyone know, and we'll post the new date on the website as well. And the draft budget is proposed to be presented on June 3rd with the final report on June 17th for Board of Trustees approval. Again, should things be delayed for later in June, we will provide that information and the new dates. Thank you very much for your time, and I'd be happy to address any questions you have.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, please indicate so in the chat box. I see Margot has her hand up.
There, got it. Okay, so I don't know if my question necessarily is for you, Roxana, but it's probably more for either Director Miller or Superintendent Zonneveld. I noticed on slide 44, there is a decrease in psych services and child and youth counseling.
Is this a question for Roxana or?
I think you're frozen.
Mental health was a priority. So I'm just wondering why there's a decrease in psych services and child and youth counseling.
Through the chair, if I'll answer this one. I think you froze a bit during your question, Margot. So you're asking about the decrease in psychology and in child and youth counselors. Is that
so
correct?
on slide 44, there's a decrease of 3 staff. I think 2 psychology services and 1 child and youth counselor, or the other way around.
Yes. So what you're seeing is was the change in staffing that happened for this year, right? So this was the because that's the 1920. What you're seeing there, if you look at those columns, that's the change from 1819 to 1920. So that was a decrease that happened this year, which was part of the budget reduction that happened this current year. You see that between those columns? And then, so that's why you're seeing, so this current year, we have 1 less psychologist and we have 2 fewer child and youth counselors. So that was approved in the budget last spring. That help? You're on mute.
If I may jump in, Mark is correct. This is part of the big reductions, as I mentioned before, of 189 positions that we've reduced in the current year as a result of the education funding reform that was implemented last spring for the current year. So the staffing just shows you the prior year and the current year, and it does not include the additional resources that we are planning for next year. So
okay, I was confused, a little bit confused there, because I didn't understand how I hadn't picked it up before, but thank you.
Mark, did you have your hand up?
Yes, so I just wanted to speak briefly to slide, if you've got it there in front of you, because I know this was shared with you in advance. Slide 49. This is the almost, it's the third last slide in the presentation, and that's the this is what in the past, those of you who've been on SEAC for a while, this is what I would typically have brought to SEAC in the past, were the our proposed changes to the budget for this coming year, because this is where we're looking for SEAC's input for your comments, questions, suggestions on these changes. So on slide 49 starts with additional self-contained classes. So these are for we're having more requests for students to enter these classes. So we're adding those, and you've seen the proposed additions in my superintendent's update that was also included with tonight's agenda materials. So that's what that is. Communication classes, we don't include those in self-contained because they don't fit the parameters, the ministry's parameters for self-contained classes, so they're considered programs instead. And we have more referrals for students for those classes, so that's the reason why for those to be added. The next point there, really the word additional isn't there, because these are new positions. So the itinerant learning disability resource support teachers, these are teachers that will be specialists in supporting students with learning disabilities who need additional support in learning to read. So these teachers, we don't know for sure how many we'll be able to hire, depending on the budget. As you heard Superintendent Nagoy say, we're hoping to get the budget announcement this week or as soon as possible from the ministry to confirm our funding. So if the dollars arrive, we're hoping to hire these teachers in that they can have some specific areas of focus for next year. First would be our learning disability classes, to be able to support those teachers and students in making sure that they really have the knowledge and skills to focus on a phonemic approach to supporting students learning to read with learning disabilities, and also some students in our system that we know have plateaued with some of their reading skills. We often see this around that grade 2-3 level. So we want to help those CERTs in those schools learn the skills to be able to support those students. So there's a lot of capacity building within our system that will happen through these teachers. The increase in CERTs, that's both elementary and secondary because of the growth in our student population. The specialized behavior support workers. I'm not sure I like this title. We're still struggling with the right title there, but that's what we've had in our document so far. This is a recognition that we have the needs of our students have become more and more complex over time, and we need some very specialized staff to be able to support those students. So these are staff that we are would like to hire that have some very specific skills in working with students with some more extreme externalized behaviors. So both this and the LD reading support are really a starting point. These are new roles, so we're starting small with these, and we're going to try them in specific areas with specific students. The intent being that we get good at doing this in a small number to start, with an eye towards potentially growing the roles depending on how things go. So that's what that role is. The ABA facilitators, we currently have 4 of these in our system, and there's been a real appreciation of what they bring to our schools, working with students with ASD, and so we'd like to increase that number so we can provide more support. Their skills are really in high demand. The last 2 points, the mental health strategy, this is to put some funding in place for hopefully for the going forward. We have a new multi-year plan, as you know, being developed because we had a chance for input through SEAC, and recognition that the mental health strategy is an important part of that plan. And so this is to put some funding in place to support that work going forward. And then finally, some more additional educational assistance, again, in recognition of the growth of our student population. I just wanted to give you some specific detail around those areas, and certainly welcome questions, comments from SEAC around those.
Okay, and I see that Deidre has her hand up.
Hi there. I just wanted to clarify. Obviously, we felt that we saw a lot of reductions last year. So we must be expecting to see an increase in funding over last year to be able to put some of these new initiatives in place and do some hiring in these new areas. I think it looks fantastic. And hopefully a lot of these things can come into play. And I'm just clarifying that your expectation is that you'll see additional funding this year.
That is an excellent question. Oh, yeah, yes, there will be additional funding, both as a result of growth in enrollment overall, as well as a result of the support for student funding that is being provided to the various labor groups in the new agreements. And I'll pass it on to Superintendent Zonneveld. Thank you.
No, you answered just fine, Roxana.
Can I weigh in on that? Deirdre? It's Stuart.
Go ahead, Stuart.
We will likely also get additional funding. It's got to be for classroom use, so it may not be designated or enveloped for special education needs. But our current secondary school average is 24.85, and the negotiated deal will be at 23.1. 23 to 1, so it's 24.85 to 1 now for our secondary school classes. The new deal will be 23 to 1, which will result in some additional funding. Now, it'll need to be spent on classroom sections, but it will be spent, so we'll have smaller class sizes. So there's an indirect support as well with some smaller class sizes, which some students with needs, other kids as well, will benefit from.
Any other questions? Oh, Allison has a question, please.
Hello. Okay, I just wanted to say on behalf of the Learning Disabilities Association that I'm very supportive of these proposed investments. The itinerant reading support teachers sounds like a wonderful step in the right direction, particularly focusing on grades 2 and 3, where there has been a lack of continuity of service. So that's wonderful. And also to see the increase in EAs, particularly in addition with the behavior support workers. So perhaps allowing us to have our EAs focus more on the educational needs rather than some of the more challenging behaviors that they have been having to focus on. And I'm particularly grateful to see some of these suggestions that I recognize that we've discussed in past SEAC meetings, making their way into the budget. So I just like, on behalf of all SEAC, to express our gratitude that mental health support, increased self-contained classes, EAs, reading support, all these kind of things that we've discussed at many meetings has actually made it into the proposed budget. So thank you.
I don't see any additional speakers. So over to you, Lou. And I see now Mark has his hand up.
So maybe I'll just say that we will appreciate your feedback and your support of these proposals. You know, we're hopeful that the money will come that allow us to do all these things. And certainly when it comes to our June meeting, we'll share back an update of where we're at with the budget, how we've been, if we've been able to bring in all of these roles and this work into the system. We'll bring you that update in June.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I believe that concludes this item, and I thank Superintendent Roxana Nagoy for being with us tonight and presenting on the budget. Thank you very much. And thank you, Stuart, for joining and answering questions as well. Over to you, Lou.
You're welcome, Joanna.
Okay, so moving on to our action, we are now at 2.2, a new chair and vice chair election, and the timing of those elections. And I'd like to hand it over to Joanna.
Okay, thank you. So just to provide some context to this item, we are shortly wrapping up the 2019-2020 school year, a memorable one for sure for our students and staff and the world. And we would like to see if there's any interest amongst the members in taking on the role of the chair or vice chair. There's an opportunity for change and for other committee members to take on these roles. As you recall, this current SEAC, Special Education Advisory Committee, was formed in January of 2019 for a 4-year term following the HDSB trustee elections of 2018. As per Regulation 464/97, committee members elected the chair and vice chair at the start of the term. As you know, besides the association representatives and community at large members, there are 4 trustee reps on this committee. Margot and I are the voting members, and Heather and Tracy are the alternate non-voting members. It is important to note that the 4 of us had decided at the beginning of the term to switch our roles midway through the term, so that would be as of January 2021. This was decided in order to allow each trustee the opportunity to fully engage, learn, and fully participate with SEAC during the course of the term. And so as of next January, Margot and I will become the non-voting alternate members. So there are 2 questions to the committee at the moment. And that is whether any members are interested in taking the role of the chair and vice chair. And if so, we need to agree on what the timeline for this change would be. Lou and I are, and of course, I'm sure the same goes for my fellow trustee reps, would be happy to work with any of you and support anyone interested in taking on these roles. I think In terms of looking at the timelines, there are two reasonable options. One would be to align the term with the start of the new school year. So that would mean June election for startup of in September, or to remain status quo and align with the committee's anniversary. So that would be the beginning of the calendar year, January. And that would mean an election in December for January startup. So before we go into discussion, where I will ask you to please indicate in that chat box with your hand, I will pass it over to Mark to maybe reflect on how this worked in the past. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Joanna. So historically, we have done an election for a new chair and vice chair each January or February, with it being a year's time, because that has coincided with when the new SEAC is first formed, which is in January of each, after the new board election. So we followed that in the past. To be honest, we haven't always had a lot of change or turnover because historically SEAC members haven't exactly been clamoring for the job. So we haven't necessarily seen much in terms of an election, usually more acclamations, and often with people continuing for a number of, if you want to call them, terms going forward. And I do have in front of me on one of my screens here the trustees in the last year or so developed a special education advisory governance procedure. So I've looked that up on our board's website. It's under policies, SEAC governance. And on the chair section, it's brief, so I'll read it to you. It says the chair and vice chair shall be elected from amongst the SEAC members at the first SEAC meeting of the term. The process for the election of the chair and vice chair shall follow the board bylaws, similar to the board chair and vice chair.
All right, Mark, can you share your screen so people can read it?
Yeah, sure.
Try that. Thanks.
I've got lots of things going on here. Make sure I get the right one. Can you see that? I'll make it a bit bigger for you. Can everyone see that now? Sorry, I can't see your faces, so.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So you can see what I'm referring to here about so this is all that's mentioned in terms of the term. It says of the term, and maybe I should know this. I'm not sure if the term refers to the 4-year term or if it refers to just 1 year, but there's nothing here that really says about the frequency of which we do this. So I guess that's really the question that is being posed to the committee is knowing that we have a process here for electing the chair and vice chair. Do you want it to coincide with the school year, which is really how we function, as you know, as a school board, is based on the school year, or do you want it to coincide with the term of the board, which runs, the new board start every 4 years. That new board comes together in December. So just providing a little of that history and also what's in this governance procedure.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So we can have a discussion, and I'll ask you to please indicate with your hand in the chat box that you'd like to speak. And I see Margot has her hand up.
Hold on, I'm trying to figure out how to, where's the, okay, I can't find how to put myself back on the screen. It disappeared. My point was going to be is that if we are going to have the elections in September and we as trustees are switching roles, if we are looking at a trustee being either the chair or the vice chair, that would make it very difficult. Over. Ah, there it is. Ah. There I am.
Yes.
Thank,
Okay, James, you have a question?
I just think that I agree with Margot. I feel that September is kind of a busy time of year, and I'm just wondering if it would be better to be either December or January. As Mark was mentioning too, that there's a change that occurs then. A slower time might be more appropriate. It's something to think about.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to speak to this? Okay, so I'm hearing that September is not a favorable change of positions. So then we're looking at a change up for January, which would mean a December election. And is everybody in agreement with that? Or maybe if you are opposed to that, if you could please let us know. I'm not seeing any speakers, so we'll take that we'll be looking at this again near the end of this calendar year for a possible election in December for a January startup. Does that make sense, Mark?
Yeah, I think we would be bringing this up again in December so people can be thinking about that and then come to the January meeting for the election.
Okay. All right, so we will defer this item. Oh, Margot has her hand up.
Okay, so my other question is, so will we then be looking at this as a year term? So again, Mark was saying there was no definitive term defined in our SEAC policy. So when people are looking at their options, committing for a year is very different than committing for 2.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering there if at a time maybe we can look at, because you currently are into your 2nd year, so will we be looking at it back to back to a single year?
Yeah, and I think that's a discussion that we would have by deferring this item till later in the year. We can address the timing at that point. Let me just check. I see Allison has her hand up.
Yeah, if we're going to defer it, then that's fine. Again, my comment related to the timing is that obviously the chair has to remain impartial. So for a long extended period, that does restrict the ability of an association to have their voice heard.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's okay, so we'll be revisiting this item later in the year. Okay, over to you, Lou.
Okay, moving right along. Okay, so we will revisit this later on. Now we're moving to item 2.3, which is association presentations. Do we have any? And this question is for Lorna.
So for your information, if you recall, there was a spreadsheet that was shared with the invitation where each association can indicate their interest in delivering a presentation about their association, the services that it provides, and their members. You may select a date. So I don't think we have any volunteers for this month, but if you're interested in, thank you, Lorna, for confirming that. But if you're interested in presenting in June or September on, please go back to that spreadsheet and indicate your timing preference. And that follows in suit with Allison's and Diane's presentation on the Learning Disabilities Association of Halton Hamilton. Okay, so that's done. Thank you.
Okay, moving right along to item 3, and that is the SEAC discussion and question period. Do we have any items for discussion that have been brought forward?
Okay, Lauren, Lou, I do have a reminder again, and that's, again, if you recall, prior to the April meeting, which was our first virtual meeting, which we hosted by teleconference, Lorna shared a document with the committee entitled Questions and Answers, and that was meant to collect questions that your association members may have related to student needs and any continuation of learning issues students may be experiencing during the current school closures as a result of the pandemic. So staff can provide answers to these questions, which you may then take back to your association. So I just wanted to remind you that this document will continue to live, and you may submit any questions or issues as they arise, and they will be addressed as soon as possible, and then we can also bring them up for discussion at the subsequent meeting. And having said that, Sophia Siddiqui, who had sent her regrets on behalf of Down Syndrome Association, had shared with us a question, and I'm just going to quickly paraphrase that for you. And then I know there was another question from Mike Brown. I think there was a question from Mike Brown. So if somebody has that available, I will ask them to please, I believe Lorna would have received it, to paraphrase that for us or to copy and paste it into the chat. So the question from Sophia is around how are the supports that students would typically get in classroom being provided now that we have online learning model? Is there direction given to teachers as far as additional support? It seems that the level of support is varying between families. Some children have full EAs. Some children who have full-time EAs are not getting them. So, Mark, I will direct that question to you, please.
Sure. So maybe I'll start with saying that I think we were neglected to send the link again for the document where people could pose their questions. So we'll be sure to include that with the agenda documents for next meeting. So just if people have lost that link from last time, we'll make sure we resend that. And I made a note in the chat bar that I looked at Mike's question that he sent. It's the same one as Sophia's. I think it's on, they both sent the same question on behalf of Halton Down Syndrome. So that's actually a great question. It looks different from student to student because we want it to look different. We want it to really be tailored to the needs of each student, what those specifics look like. Because the needs of the student and the realities of the home for each family are quite different during this school closure. So what we've asked schools to do is to work closely with families to understand what the student learning needs are during the closure and what supports best fit. It's also a recognition that we're not trying to replicate school during this closure. That's not possible. That's not our intention. And so therefore, this is more about what are the learning needs of that student and how can we best support the family, especially our students with some of the more more intensive special needs. How can we support the family in meeting those needs? So we do have some staff. It's not necessarily EAs. Sometimes it is, but we do have some staff who are working more intensely with students and families. But once again, the intention is to make it really fit for that student and family. So that's why it varies across students and families. And certainly I encourage, Sophia or Mike, if they want more. I appreciate that them sending in their question, even though they couldn't join us tonight. So I certainly encourage them to reach out to me if I could provide them with more helpful information. Be more than happy to do that.
Thank you, Mark. Are there any more questions? If not, then James.
I see that James has his hand up.
Yes, I'm just curious. This question would be for Mark. Is how does the board if the board can follow up on student, I guess the word would be compliance in terms of reporting to teachers and being engaged in the online activities?
Another great question. Thanks, James. This is an ongoing challenge for staff is what does that engagement look like? I think we're more successful with that with some of the younger grades, partly because they tend to be more engaged in school to start with, but also if parents are able to support them, then the engagement is there. As you get into the older grades, that tends to be more of a challenge. I was talking to a teacher the other day who was a class of 25 in an applied math class, and she's got 4 students who are regularly doing the work, and engaging in the activities and the lessons. And she has connection time every day that the students can connect with her, directly, and it's not happening. So it's a challenge. I think you used the word enforcement, James, and we're trying to be very, very mindful that the situations for each student and family, again, really vary across our system. So, we have situations where, for example, they might have a lot of difficulty with the ability for the members of the family to get on technology through the course of a day. And that's part of the reason why we are doing an asynchronous model where it's not, classes at 9 o'clock and everyone has to be on, because we know that would exclude, many students because they couldn't necessarily make that work. We have older students in high school who we know some situations where, the parents are out of work and the students are working far more shifts at the grocery store, for example, to help with the family income. And so the expectations that we might have around that student's participation and engagement with the work needs to be different than it would be if the student was able to attend class every day, and on, right? The mental health needs that are out there, and there's so many challenges. So it really needs to be an individual approach. I know that I've spoken with a number of staff who are trying to make sure they connect directly with the family, with some of our students with some of the more extreme special needs, trying to really make sure there's that individual contact on a regular basis to explore how best to engage that student. We have students who need regular support around instruction around personal hygiene and personal care and all those kinds of things. We're really trying to support parents around how to engage in that as effectively as they can at home. That's just as, as an example. But it's a great question, James, because we have some really high levels of participation. We know that in some classes in some schools, and some real, at the other end of the spectrum where it's not happening. And so it is a challenge for our staff. No question.
And I see that James has a follow-up question.
Have you had any problems or have you had any issues arise with providing the technology for the students to be able to engage online? Again, it's for Mark.
Yeah. Thanks for that, James. We've worked really hard to make sure that that's not an issue. So it's also, as a starting point, when we first when the shutdown and when the closure first happened, we had our schools all surveying their students and families to find out who had access to technology and connectivity at school, at home. If they had that, great. If not, then we looked at what did they need. Some students may have just needed a Chromebook, and that was fine. Some a laptop, some an iPad, depending on their needs. Students with special needs who had some specific technology, we tried to get them to that early on. In some cases, we accessed schools again a second time to get some of that technology out for them. So we did those kinds of things. And again, to make sure that was the case. We also had some staff who needed some technology at home. So again, principals were pulling out technology, and we did a lot of curbside pickups for families to be able to do a drive-by and pick up the technology that they needed. We then had connectivity questions for families, and so we've done a few things with that, where we have partnered with Bell and Cogeco to do either a hub, like an internet hub in the house for students that didn't have connectivity through Cogeco. And we've also looked at, in some cases, I'm not sure the right term, a turbo stick or a rocket stick, that picks up a cell signal to work through a laptop in a home. I'm not sure, I don't think we've given out actual cell phones to students, but we've really tried to find as many ways and partnerships in our community to make that happen. Finally, we've had some students and families either who have just really poor connectivity where they live, they're in a more rural area, and they either can't, their internet connection is really poor, and or they can't get good cell connection. We've then been the offer is to load up USB sticks with content and materials and videos, etc., and we've been sending those home. And for some students, we know that their best resources to work with are in print. So we've been sending print materials home on a regular basis. And even, our students who need large print, for example, or need Braille materials, etc. And we've been partnering with our bus companies who have been doing pickups at staff homes and taking those to students and families for us. So we've really tried to draw on a lot of different sources to try and make sure that we're making the learning accessible to all of our students. I wouldn't say it's been perfect, but with 65,000 students, if we're not reaching everybody, it's a really, really small number, and we're still working at that. But I think by and large, we've been really, really successful.
All right, thank you, Mark. And I see a question from Deidre, please.
Hello again. Hi. This might be a little preemptive, but June is almost upon us, and I'm just curious to, as many parents probably are, about what might be talked about for what's coming in September. should we possibly be looking at going back and whether or not those conversations are happening? And just obviously you can't say too much as of right now because I'm sure we're still focusing on getting some of this distance education ironed out. But if everybody's talking a little bit about what going back in September might look like, should there not be a vaccine, and if those conversations are happening.
You guys are loaded with great questions tonight. Yes, we are certainly talking about this a lot right now. We needed to get not past, but sort of get all the startup of the distance learning going, and I think we've moved well down that road. And we are certainly talking then about going back. We actually have a couple different teams looking at this right now. And we know we're not the only board looking at this either, right? So we have some networks with other boards around this. One team is looking at, maybe for a lack of better words, sort of contingency plans. What are the things that if we're not back, and even if we are back there is the potential we might be back this year. How often, any of that, I don't know. But if that were to happen, there are still things that either won't happen or will have to happen differently. So, an easy example, for example, is graduation, where we would normally pack in hundreds of people into gyms and halls and all that kind of thing. We will still have students that graduate. So what will that look like? Do we have any other options that we can do to still make that a special event? Whether that be now, this year or in the fall or in other formats, other ways to do that kind of thing. But there are many, many other things that this contingency committee is looking at. We have another committee that's basically a school opening, a return to school committee that's looking at all the factors that go into this. I think I know you're all following the news and you've heard comments saying, reopening the economy will probably be more challenging than it was to shut it down because of all the things that we need to do differently now with our businesses. The same is for schools, right? For us to reopen, there's so many things we're going to need to do differently. So we have a number of staff on that committee and a bunch of subcommittees looking at how will we reopen. And so I'm sure you can imagine things like all the factors we'd have to put into social distancing, personal protective equipment, how do we do the number of kids in a room, hallways, gyms, all of our processes, how do we do busing, on and on and on. There are many things that we'll be doing differently. We're certainly watching, reading, learning what's happening in other parts of the world and in our country, because this is already in various states of progress in some other places, and at least in their planning. So we're looking at a lot of that information to learn from them, what works, what doesn't work, and how we can move forward with that. So, our number one concern in all of this is the safety of our kids and our staff. So, however, and we obviously will be taking a lot of direction from the province and from public health. So all of that will factor into our plans going forward. And we know that our families and students and staff need to have a lot of confidence in coming back to school, to know that we as a board are doing everything we can to keep everyone safe. So that's all part of the work and the plan that's going on. I hope that's helpful.
I don't see any other speakers on the list. Okay, Lou, we can continue on.
Okay, moving along then. We are now at the superintendent's report, so it's back to Mark again.
Thanks, and I won't, I know I have a fair bit in my report. I'm not going to speak to all the items there. There are some links in the pandemic school closure update, the first item. I encourage you to take a look at those. And just a hats off to the staff. They've done fabulous work. Those are just two samples, one high school at MM Robinson and another a class in the elementary school at Heritage Glen. Just two examples of the kinds of things that are going on with those students. And you're only seeing what's posted on that website, right? There's such great interactions and supports going on. But that gives you a little sample. I thought you might appreciate that. And then the parent resources, there's two links there on our board website. Hats off to the staff, really have pulled together great resources and supports there for students and families to draw upon in the work. Those are broad, general ones that are being used and available to all students and families. Please know that there are very specific things also going on between the school and those students as well. So just some samples. I'm going to touch on the structured learning class. The second item that, we've been doing a pilot that we've extended there. We've decided to extend it for one more year. And the reason being that the students have been transitioning back to their home schools over the past few months, obviously before the closure. And we want to know how the students are doing when they're back in their regular school, a regular class. Because that was the whole point of this, is that we support the students in the growth of their skills around their social interactions and their impulse control and their communication skills, all those kinds of things. We wanted to see some real growth there and then see how well they do back in that regular class setting. And if they flourish there, then that really tells us about the success of the program. If they digress and struggle, then we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? So this coming year is a year of supporting those classroom teachers of those students to help them be able to support those students there and to monitor the students in a number of areas where we've been collecting data over time to see how they do. So the classes are closing. The pilot continues because now we're monitoring the students back in their regular classes. And I'm going to skip down past the after-school development program. I think you can expect that. I've typically brought new self-contained classes here or changes in those classes each year, so I'm just sharing those with you. I'm going down to the last two items. The Nelson CPP area, we've been certainly having questions from parents about the readiness of that area for the students to transition over from Robert Bateman. And we have had a bit of a cushion, a window to have that area ready. Obviously, our intention was to have it ready this spring and have the students come in, do some transition visits through the spring. Both the ability to visit, we know isn't possible right now. We also had a construction shutdown for about 3 weeks, and the province just confirmed on, I think it was Thursday or Friday, to say that construction can resume for essential projects such as school construction. So we have the go-ahead for the Nelson work to continue, and we're quite confident that the CPP area will be ready before the start of school in September. So that's great news, because that was a concern for us. So the transition planning will go on. I believe I shared with you before when we talked about the CPP area at Nelson, that we were gathering parent, staff feedback, which we've done. Also, Community Living Burlington also gave us feedback, all very positive about the CPP area in the school and the outdoor space. And wanted to share with you that what we heard was very positive about the outdoor space, and that the decision was to extend the split rail fence a little bit and to add more plantings to address some of the concern around the proximity to the street. But lots of positives when parents knew that they would also be able to access the courtyard, which is an enclosed space within the school property, and the track, which is also enclosed. So lots of positives there. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you was the importance around food security. And because we through our connections with the kids and families, we know that there are students and families for whom shelter is an issue during the pandemic. We know food is an issue for a number of them. So we've been working with all these community agencies, you can see on the update, to make sure that we're connecting families with those agencies to make sure they can get the food that they need. Because if we're not addressing those issues, then all the learning pieces, we know we can't get to those either, right? So I wanted you to hear that we're focusing on the whole student, the whole family, to try and support them through this. I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. Do we have any questions? Okay.
Lou, you were on mute.
Yes, I was. Sorry. Okay, moving on to item 4.2, which is the association reports. Do we have any that have indicated they wish to share?
Okay, I see a hand up from Allison.
Sorry, just trying to get it all working. Here we go. Okay, so the Learning Disabilities Association of Halton Hamilton actually has quite a lot to share today. So despite the pandemic and the necessary shutdown of our in-person services, we are continuing to provide support and training for all of our clients. Our staff are working from home and are available to answer parent questions by phone or email. All of our programs have been moved online and continue to be available to support students for whom online learning is an option. This week, we're launching a new session of our SOAR program, which is teaching students in grades 6 to 8 about their own learning disability, self-advocacy skills, and the skills necessary for a successful transition to high school. That is obviously an online program, and as I mentioned, that starts on Saturday. The Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario has partnered with LearnStyle, a technology company that does a lot of the in-school support for many boards. They are offering free technology support classes to any students with learning disabilities or who need to access that support. If the students or families come to our website, they'll find out more information about that free tech support that is available, that our association has organized. The Ontario Human Rights Commission survey on the right to read is now open for teachers and professionals to offer their input on difficulties facing students with learning to read. So we would encourage any teachers, professionals to let their voice be heard and to support the Human Rights Commission's work into advocating the rights of students to learn to read. And finally, LDAHH is very pleased to announce that we have secured pandemic response funding from both Hamilton and Burlington, and will shortly be launching free one-on-one tutoring for literacy and math skills with identified or suspected learning disabilities. It will be provided by Ontario certified teachers and is designed to support students and in turn teachers and school boards in ensuring that essential remediation and support for students with learning disabilities continues despite the pandemic. We will send out further information on this program to our community partners as soon as it's available. The funding was just announced yesterday, and we welcome your support in spreading our message and helping identify students who would benefit from this particular learning at this time. Thank you.
Are there any other updates from any of the associations? Okay, I don't see any, so we're okay to proceed.
Okay, the next item, 4.3 is the trustee report, and it's over to you, Margot.
I'm trying to get on. I look green, right? Can you see me?
No, it's green screen.
Okay, it might come. Maybe I'll come with like pretty trees behind me or something. There's not a lot to report with the trustees update right now. We continue to meet. I know, I don't know why. Sorry, I'm gonna try again. Hold on, let me do this. It's very strange. I don't know why it's doing that. I just tried to turn it off and on. Okay, so as I said, we continue to meet virtually, well, actually through teleconferencing. But this meeting that we're having tonight with SEAC is seen as a trailblaze in the idea of virtual meetings. So this might be something that we try out at the trustee meetings, which would be great. The one point of interest is that next Thursday was when we were having our Student of Excellence Awards. It was supposed to be at Garth Webb, but instead of having it live, we are going to have it virtual. So it will continue at the same time, and we will be honoring our Students of Excellence for this year. I think that's really all I have to tell you about. Sorry, I'm green screened.
Thank you, Margot. Are there any other committee reports? If not, I will ask Joanna.
Okay, yes. Just to check first, is there an update from the Parent Involvement Committee? Indicate or chime in? Okay, not. Okay then. So I will present on the Accessibility Coordinating Committee. As you recall, Mary Marshall presented to SEAC at the December meeting. And while the meetings of the committee had to be canceled due to pandemic, although some might be continuing through, of course, the work continues despite that. So Mary had provided us with some key action items that have been taken care of since that meeting in December. The Accessibility Compliance Report was submitted to the Ministry of Seniors and Accessibility back in December. And the specific areas under review include information and communication, transportation, employment, design of public spaces, and customer service. 2 administrative procedures were updated, and these are attendance management and individual work accommodation. The human resources professional development sessions were delivered to several employee groups. And the areas of focus for these PDs were information sharing, attendance support, accommodations, and disability management process. If you recall, we had a bit of a showcase on the changes that have been made to the hcsb.ca website. So the accessibility to our HCSB website was assessed, and several changes were made as a result. The Access IB was added, whereas the end user can adjust all the visible features on the website to enhance accessibility. So one would look for a round blue icon of a person in a wheelchair and click on that, and that would present a number of options. And finally, last but not least, the Creating a Culture of Accessibility in the HDSB document was developed in January. It was meant to be launched in the spring of this year, but of course that had to be put on hold. So this updated document provides a resource for board personnel to consult when working and interacting with members of the public, including parents who may have a disability. So I don't know if there are any questions, but if I've made any errors or omissions, I'll ask Sean to please correct me. And that is it for my update. And we will go on to updates from the Equity and Inclusive Education Advisory Steering Committee. Is there anything from that group through our rep?
We have not had any meetings because of the closures of the schools and the school board.
Thank you, Diane. And is there anything further on the Nelson Bateman High School Integration Steering Committee or Central and Bateman High School Integration Steering Committees? I don't believe there is.
Yeah, sorry, just jump in. But the Central and Nelson committees meetings are on hold at this time.
Thank you. I believe that's the case for a vast number of the committees, as our staff are incredibly busy addressing the needs of the students as a result of school closures and the continuation of learning through online. So thank you, everybody. And over to you, Lou.
Okay, we are now at item 5.0, which is next agenda items. And Joanna, I'll ask you to speak to this item.
Okay, so as you recall, early in our term, we had created a list of topics for discussion. Some of these topics require presentations by staff, and in fact, vast majority of them do. And so given the pandemic and the school closures and the shift to online learning, staff are incredibly busy responding to the student needs. Therefore, the list needs to be put on hold until a time when staff will be able to meet with the committee and presentations. In the meantime, I'll ask everyone to please consider any other topics that you would like to include. This list will be possibly assessed over the summer months, and a timeline for presentations will be built pending the progression of the pandemic and staff availability. So we can open up for discussion here. I do know that Mark has his hand up, but anybody else, if you have any suggestions for a topic that you would like to include or have any questions at this time, please indicate so in the chat box. And over to you, Mark.
So as I mentioned, I'll come back next month with a budget update of hopefully great news about the things we're able to include. Also, you may recall that at our June meeting, I'll bring you the final version of the special education plan, which will include any of the changes as a result of the budget process, and also any final changes of processes that we may have made through the spring in preparation for next year. So those two items, the budget and the spec ed plan, will come back next month.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And are there any suggestions for topics or questions at this time related to future agenda topics? I'm not seeing any. Thank you.
Okay. At this time, we have exhausted our agenda items. And so I am calling for this meeting to be adjourned. So thank you, everybody, for joining us and for our first virtual meeting. And the meeting is now adjourned. Bye, everyone.